Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Summer. For this week's video, I'm going to be diving in with you guys to educate you on 3 different cutting techniques: blunt cutting for a full baseline, point cutting to help soften the ends, and texturizing that really gets in to remove bulk and add extra movement to your haircut. This video is going to be great for newbie stylists, cosmetology students, or if you're just somebody browsing on YouTube trying to teach themselves for an at-home haircut. I'm going to be breaking down each technique, why to use one over the other, so let's get started. All right, so to start off, we are going to be doing blunt cutting first. This is the most basic, easiest option. Blunt cutting is going to be good for people who like their hair, let's say, all one length, a thick full end on the bottom. You can do blunt cutting for layers. It's not my preferred method, but we're gonna get started and I'm gonna show you guys the technique for blunt cutting. All right, so I've just got her sectioned off so that way you guys can see. So we're just gonna come in starting with the blunt cut. Blunt cutting is just gonna be a straight across hard line. And when you are holding your scissors, I have swivel thumb, so I'm able to move my thumb. So your scissors at home might be different, but you only want to move your thumb when cutting. You don't want to be moving your ring finger at all. When you move your ring finger, you end up opening the scissor up way too much. You want to hold basically your finger steady and only move that thumb. Use your index finger almost to push down on your shear to keep it steady, and then move your thumb. Okay, so we're just going to come in here right in the middle, and I'm going to show you guys the appropriate way to cut it first. So I've got my index finger here holding it nice and tight, opening with my thumb, and we're just coming straight on over. So we're opening up with my thumb only, cutting. You want to make sure you're holding tension while you close with your thumb. Technically, you're not supposed to cut past your knuckle here, but I don't know a single hairstylist that follows that rule. But if you're starting out, it's a better way to do it, so that way you have a little bit more control in your cutting. We're gonna just finish off this last section. Okay, so we're gonna come into our next section, which when you are cutting, whether it's in salon or at home, you wanna work in sections that are gonna be thin enough where you can always see your guide down below. That way you are not missing your line. That is what's gonna mess you up. If you take too thick of sections, it's harder to see and you'll end up either cutting it too long or too short in your section. So small sections are key. You wanna always be able to see through to your guide. So we're just gonna come in and I'm gonna keep showing you guys again. Make your index finger kind of like your focal point to hold it steady and just open up with that thumb. So blunt cutting, like I said, I like to do it. It's great for a one length haircut. I typically always will blunt cut my baseline just because most people do like to see the ends looking full. Point cutting is where you're gonna create a little bit softer of a line, and we'll touch on that in just a minute here. But it just keeps it nice and thick and full looking. You don't have any jaggedness at all. It keeps the weight there at the ends, which is what a lot of people care to see. And I'm gonna do one more section of blunt cutting here, and then I'm gonna show you if you're gonna do a layer, the blunt cutting as well. Just coming in, again, nice small section, so you can see through to your guide. I always like to work in the middle and then work my way. I typically always go to my left side and then I'll finish on the right side afterwards. Okay. So I'm just gonna finish cutting her length here, and then we're gonna come back in and I will be showing you guys how I do a blunt layer. Okay, so I just have some of her hair clipped off here so it's easier to work with because it is dry. But to do a blunt layer, you're gonna do it the same as you would do the positioning for any sort of layering. But where I typically, I'll show you guys when I do point cutting, I'll show you now. I typically like to just come in and cut this way to keep the lines off. That is point cutting. So with blunt cutting, you're just gonna come in and literally just go up the same way all through the hair. So you're keeping a nice hard line. And you would just move up the head the same as you would like you were layering the hair, but instead of cutting into it like you've probably seen me do in my other videos, I'm keeping more of that hard line. So then we would just take our next section. Again, when the hair is wet, it's easier to just comb it forward and keep it out of the way, but because the hair is dry here is why I'm clipping. And you would just go in and follow your guide, coming straight out. I can see the hair popping through here and cutting. And again, always remember, only move that thumb. Use your index finger to keep your scissors steady. And again, my shears, it's a swivel thumb shears, so they look a little bit different. I'm able to rotate my thumb completely. Regular shears, you're gonna be a little bit more stationary with it. So blunt cutting is also a good option when, let's say you have somebody who hasn't had their hair cut in forever, their ends are shattered. Blunt cutting is gonna be a way to cut off that dead to help make it look fuller, where if you choose to go in and still point cut, it's might look like they still need a haircut. Now, obviously, if the client likes a more textured look on their ends, then do your point cutting, which we're about to head into. But otherwise, I find with blunt cutting, when somebody's got really long hair that's all shattered looking, the blunt cut is the best option to thicken up those ends and make it look more full. Okay, so here we have on this one side here, her blunt cut layers. You've still got that nice thick weight line at the bottom. Usually with blunt cutting, when you run your hands through it, you feel like almost the heaviness. Feels like a nice fresh haircut. And then you've still got movement in the layers, but they're not quite as cut into looking. So now I'm gonna move into point cutting and show you guys, again, starting from the bottom, working our way up. And on this other side, I will do the point cutting layers. So maybe, I don't know if we'll be able to see visually as much the difference, but that's what we're gonna go for. So I'm gonna section her back off, and then we're gonna come back down to the base to show you guys point cutting. Okay, so we're now back down at the bottom. And so like I said with blunt cutting before, we're opening up and we're coming in straight on with our haircut. So the difference with point cutting, instead of having your hands horizontal as you would with blunt cutting, you're gonna angle your hands up more vertically. So you're gonna come in, take your section, and you're just gonna cut into it at a point. So this creates much more of a softer, not piecey per se, but a more lived in look, to me is a better way to describe it. Point cutting is definitely going to be a more difficult learning curve over blunt cutting, just because it's easier to cut this way and you're cutting in towards your fingers, so you certainly don't want to snip at them. But basically with point cutting, you're kind of going in, and as you come out is when you want to lower your thumb. So we're going in, and when we're pulling out, we're lowering that thumb to cut into the hair. So like I said, where somebody, let's say they're coming in, they haven't had their hair cut in like 6 months, and they're really shattered looking, the blunt cut is gonna make that look cleaner. Where point cutting, let's say you're removing the length, but you're not necessarily filling in where they might have some really thin pieces on the end. So you're just gonna continue to move up your section, again, taking small sections so you can always see your guide as you go. And then I still like to start in the middle, go in, and cut as you're pulling out. You can come in and have your hands almost at a horizontal and do it, but you're kind of curving open. So the best way, I would say, if you're starting out, have it more at a vertical and just come into it. And this type of point cutting for cutting your base, it's still gonna create somewhat of a fuller line, not obviously as full as your blunt cutting, but you can create that little extra bit of softness cutting it this way on the ends over the blunt cutting. And then typically with point cutting, I like to keep my fingers above my guide by quite a bit, just so you can really see and you can cut into it a little bit easier. Where if they're too low, that's when you might accidentally nip yourself. I still occasionally will nip myself, it just happens. But if you are newer, keep those fingers a good 1/2 inch to 1 inch above your guideline to just give yourself enough room to go in and cut into it without jeopardizing your other fingers. All right, so I'm just gonna finish off point cutting her hair here, and then when I come back in, we will be cutting the layers on the other side in a point cut to show you the difference. Okay, so we have the rest of her point cutting done on the base. And then you can see it's just a little bit softer of a line, not by a ton, but just barely. So like I said, I still like point cutting a lot of my ends just to keep it soft depending on how thick their hair is. Finer hair, I feel like always definitely point cut, but depending on the hair type and what your client's wanting, the point cutting just softens it just enough while still maintaining some of that weight, but a little less than the blunt cutting. So I have done the blunt style layers on this side of her head, so I'm just gonna clip that out of the way. And then the other side, I'm gonna do the point cutting so you can see the difference. Okay, so we're gonna take our section, same as you would with regular layers, and with where blunt cutting, we're coming in straight on it. Instead of doing that, we're again positioning our hands to come in at a point and cutting into it. And then you just continue working the way up the head. Again, as you're pulling out is when you wanna move into that thumb. Again, when you are pulling out of the section is when you wanna close your thumb. Bring it out, come in, point in, and cut. And then I could see my guide starting down here. With the layers, I find it's a little harder to keep your hands a little lower down on the section, where when I'm cutting the baseline, I try to keep it a good like 1/2 inch of a distance. So that should be noted, but otherwise, I actually find it easier to go in and point cut the layers over blunt cutting. That's just my personal preference. Okay, so now we have her back fully cut. So it's a little hard to see the difference, but this is the side that I did the blunt cutting, which to me just looks ever so slightly a little more choppy. If somebody has really thick, coarse hair, I don't prefer blunt cutting for my layers. It's gonna look even more of those hard, blunt, choppy lines, where the point cutting just softens it enough, ever so slightly. It's still maintaining fullness throughout it, but you have a little bit less of that harshness, kind of where you can see sort of where each layer starts and begins. So I always like to point cut for my layers, even if I'm doing a blunt cut on the bottom. But point cutting is a nice way to just overall soften it up without removing too much of the weight. And then blunt cutting, you're gonna keep as much weight as possible and have those harder, fuller lines. So now that we've touched on the two different techniques for cutting your base, and your layers. I'm gonna move into texturizing now. Texturizing you can do with point cutting, but also with actual thinning shears. So your thinning shears have your little teeth here that you're cutting into to remove the weight, but you're not removing the length. So I'm gonna show you guys how to use the thinning shears, and then I'll also show you how you can do a little bit more texturizing with point cutting that's gonna be a little less invasive compared to regular texturizing shears. So I'm just gonna split her right down the middle, and we're gonna do the texturizing on this side and then do point cut texturizing on her other side. So hopefully you guys can see the difference well. Okay, so texturizing shears, like I said, their main purpose is to remove bulk from the hair. So if somebody has super thick hair and they're like, get some of this hair out, you can go in with your texturizing shears after you've created the layers to remove more weight. You also can do them on the ends just to soften them and not remove so much bulk from the interior. So if you're looking to just texturize on the ends, you're gonna pull out like you would a regular layer, and only on the ends here are you gonna come in and cut into them. And what that's gonna do is just soften up your line a little bit more throughout your layers, but you're not cutting down deep into the interior of the hair, because once you go down into here, you're gonna remove all the hair, which is gonna create it looking too thinned out for clients, especially those who don't like texturizing shears. So you're just pulling out, same as you would your layers, and coming just on those ends and cutting into it. I keep my hands at a little bit of an angle and just move through the hair. So let's say you blunt cut somebody and you've got a couple spots where you're like, ooh, that line is not blending in, I can't get that layer to blend in. Your texturizing shears are gonna be a great option to just go in and soften that line on the ends. So that softened that up a little bit. So like when I'm looking at this, right here, this top layer, I feel like looks a little too heavy. So that's where I would come in with my texturizing shears and cut into that more. Just ever so slightly to soften it up. I like to do the bulk of my texturizing shears when the hair is dry after I've got it styled from a wet cut, but you can use them on wet hair. But if you're going in to just soften the ends, I like to do that on dry hair. So that softened it up ever so slightly. So before I show you guys how to texturize to remove bulk, I'm gonna point cut the other side so you can see the difference when using your regular shears to do texturizing with the point cutting, and then I'm going to come back through and remove bulk. All right, so now we're going to be doing the point cutting method for texturizing and removing some weight on the ends. So you're holding it similar as you would when you're cutting the layers, but this time I like to bring my hands kind of mid-level to the section, and I'm going to come in and we're going deep down into the hair. And so that is just softening it up, but you're taking out a little less hair than you are with your texturizing shears. This method of texturizing I think is by far a little bit more difficult to get the hang of it compared to the thinning shears. It's just getting used to the motion and movement. But again, we're coming in, my hands are more in the middle of the section, and we're coming into the hair nice and deep with your shears, pointing in. Again, as you pull out, move your thumb and removing some of that weight. So far less hair is coming out of the section compared to texturizing shears, but you're able to soften up those ends and cut into the interior of the hair more without removing as much of the weight and length. So I personally, I love doing deep point cutting like this. I feel like it helps soften everything up really nice. And just because a lot of clients really do, they get nervous of the thinning shears. And typically as we age, our hair naturally gets thinner. So at a certain point, like you don't really need to do the texturizing shears the same way. Like I have so many clients, let's say like 10 years ago, I would texturize the crap out of their hair with the normal texturizing shears, but now we don't need to do it as much. Your hair sort of slows down a little bit. But I've always just been a huge fan of the deep point cutting compared to the texturizing shears. It's also a little softer on the hair. Sometimes certain hair types, like let's say you're really curly, frizzy, if you do the texturizing thinning shears too much, it kind of amps that up, where the point cutting is going to keep it softer and remove some of that weight, but not compromise how your hair is naturally laying with your curl or frizz. So again, it's this very top layer on this side that I feel like looks a little kind of thick compared to her ends. So that's where I would come in with my regular shears if we're point cutting, and still cut nice and deep into that to remove a little bit more of that weight. All right, so now that we have touched on that, I'm gonna come into her sides and show you guys how we would remove actual weight and bulk from the hair using our thinning shears. Okay, so if I am looking to remove weight and bulk from somebody's hair, this is especially key if somebody has a ton of hair. I still will move in sections and work my way up. It just makes it a little bit easier. So to remove weight, instead of using my texturizing shears just at the ends to soften up, we're gonna come up higher into the hair. So I will just take my section, and I like to come in at an angle, and I'll go up pretty close. And as I'm pulling down is when I will close my thumb. So taking out all that hair here. And I like to do that in the section that I'm working on about 2 times, sometimes a third, and I'll just grab certain pieces. I'm getting this nice and texturized, thinning it out a little bit. And one thing I want to make a note of, when you are using your thinning shears, I don't ever like coming in and going straight across as if you're blunt cutting. What that ends up doing, you can create essentially a line. Even though these are thinning shears and you're texturizing, you'll end up creating a hard line. And if you haven't sectioned and you do that on the outer top layer, you're gonna have to then blend that in. So always keep your thinning shears at an angle vertically when you're going through the hair. And then I'll just continue to move up throughout my hair, doing the same thing, and I'll take just my next section. I don't need to pull from this underside because we've already cut it, and we're gonna do the same thing. Pulling out as we go with our thinning shears at an angle. And I mean, you can remove length with thinning shears if you cut enough, so just so you guys can see, I'll take this piece right here. If you come in and you cut enough times, you can remove all that length. So you're just trying to do it to soften it up and remove bulk. This would be considered way too much bulk out of one section. But I do want to make note for those of you, especially at home, that might be like, oh, this is great. Look how much I can take out of my hair. If you do it too many times, you will remove all of that length. So again, come in at an angle, cut, moving that thumb as you're pulling out and removing some of that weight. And then you can also as well almost take up the section like you're doing that deep point cutting and do it that way if you want. You can see a little bit differently, but I like to take little pieces at a time, move in the sections. That way you get a little bit more control of how much you're taking out or how little you want to take out depending on what your client is wanting. So we're on our last section here. Again, you can pull up like you're cutting a layer almost. Move that thumb as you're pulling out. Or you can do the same as we've been doing, coming into it with your hands up more vertically and cutting down the strand of hair. So yeah, but it takes out a decent amount of hair as you're gliding through. I always find gliding through as you're pulling out like that keeps it softer than just coming in and hacking away at it. But yeah, so it definitely removes quite a bit of hair, the thinning does, so that's why you want to be careful with it. That's why I like to work in sections so you can kind of see a little bit at a time, especially if you're newer to it, how much hair your thinning shears are removing. And then again, you can use them to just soften the ends if you want, or you can go in to remove full-blown bulk and weight all throughout the hair. Okay, so I just want to show you guys, so this is the side that we've taken out some of that weight with using the texturizing shears to remove bulk. And then here on her other side, I haven't cut into at all, and you can see how much more thickness that this has maintained throughout it versus when we come over here, you can see it's a lot thinner looking. So that is how it's gonna look if you're not texturizing and you're leaving that bulk in. And then if somebody is wanting it removed, it's gonna thin it out quite a bit more. All right, so those are our 3 different cutting techniques. Again, we started with blunt cutting. That is going to be great for keeping the baseline thick and full. It's great for one length haircuts or fine thin hair. Point cutting can be used for a variety of reasons. It can soften the baseline. It's a great option for lightly adding texture and is a better option for those who don't want as much bulk removed. And lastly, your thinning, texturizing shears are great for really getting in there, removing the weight and bulk, and also for softening those ends if you don't want to remove as much bulk. Final key points, only move your thumb when cutting. Keep that wrist steady, use your index finger for control, and sections are so key when you are cutting through the hair. So I hope you guys enjoyed this week's video. Please ask any questions that you might have. I'd be happy to answer for you. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next week.